Welcome to my multivariate presentation on support for social welfare. In any society, there are some people who are either too unwell or otherwise incapable of participating in the economy and social life, and so they often require social protection, which usually comes in the form of state-run social welfare programs. The purpose of my research is to examine what factors inform a respondent's public opinion on such social welfare programs. The dataset used was the 2011 Canadian Election Mailbox Survey, and the tests will include reliability analysis and hierarchical regression with controls. My own research builds on previous research which has looked at how party affiliation, property ownership, and the view that a government should intervene to reduce differences in income inform a respondent's level of support for social welfare programs. According to a study done in 1995, Petrie found that conservatives take the lead in funding for national defense, but come in third place when looking at funding for social welfare. Erickson and Matthews found that if a respondent did not own property and thus had lower levels of income, then he or she would be more likely to support social welfare. And finally, Sharp and Capluck's 2012 research paper on redistribution in Canada included important information on the negative effect of rising inequality on social welfare. To conduct this analysis, an index was created using 4 indicators which were included to more effectively measure what factors influence an individual's level of support for social welfare. The alpha score for the index is 0.636, which is above the threshold of 0.6, indicating that the indicators are related enough to form an index. Moreover, we can see from the table that the overall alpha score would be lowered if any of the indicators were to be deleted. The table here shows the unrecoded dependent variable. Low scores measured low levels of support for social welfare, whereas high scores measured high levels of support for social welfare. As can be seen, the mean is 14.2, meaning that the majority of respondents moderately supported social welfare. Moreover, the standard deviation of 2 indicates that there is some variation and dispersion around the mean. In the first model studied, 3 independent variables were tested. My first hypothesis was that if a respondent votes for the Conservative Party, then he or she will be less likely to support social welfare. My second hypothesis was that if a respondent owned property, then he or she most likely had some level of income support and so would be less likely to support social welfare. And finally, my third hypothesis was that if an individual believed the government should intervene to reduce income differences, then that individual would most likely support social welfare. Table 1 represents a correlation matrix that maps out the correlations between my dependent variable and independent variables. If you look at the first cell, cons by spending, you can see that Pearson's R, shown in green, is negative 0.237. This indicates that the more certain an individual's chances of voting for the Conservative Party are, the less likely he or she is to support social welfare. All of the results here are statistically significant and so are not due to sampling error. Moreover, when looking at the pairings of the independent variables, as shown in red, we can see that none of the variables measure the same underlying concept. Table 2 shows the results generated from a multiple regression analysis predicting support for social welfare using these 3 independent variables. The b-values recorded in the table indicate the direction and number of units change in the dependent variable due to a 1-unit change in the independent variable. For example, when controlling for the other variables, a 1 percentage point rise in the chance a respondent will vote for the Conservative Party will produce a decrease in that respondent's level of support for social welfare by 0.139. The standardized beta values show that party affiliation accounts for slightly more variation in support for social welfare than income and property. The adjusted R-square is 0.084, and so when taken collectively, the set of controlled independent variables explains 8.4% of the variation in the dependent variable. Moreover, the overall equation is highly significant, as is each independent variable, and so the results are not due to sampling error. To further my regression analysis, I wanted to see how controlling for region would affect my other variables. I hypothesized that controlling for region may weaken the effect of conservative ideology on my dependent variable, and so specification. This is because where a respondent grows up may have contributed to his or her ideology. For example, if you grew up in the prairies, you tended to be more conservative. This is supported by Donald Blake's work on regionalism and voting patterns in Canada. The region variable was recoded into 4 categories. Quebec, which I thought would have the highest level of support for social welfare, was used as the reference category, and the other categories included Ontario, the eastern parts of Canada, BC, and the prairies. I suspected that following Quebec, Ontario would be the second most likely region to support social welfare, followed by the east, BC, and finally the prairies, which tended to be more conservative as a region. Table 3 shows the two models side by side. The beta values were recorded, seeing as these values use a standard unit that is the same for all variables in the equation and thus makes it easier to compare results. We can see from the table that all three predictors show replication with almost identical beta values. Controlling for region decreases the influence of property and income on support for social welfare, but this is very slight. Moreover, the results are all highly statistically significant. What is perhaps the most interesting is how regional differences impact support for social welfare. These are shown in red in Table 3, but will be discussed on the following slide. Finally, it can be seen that the adjusted R-square figures indicate that around 9% of the variance in support for welfare is explained by views on governments reducing income differences, party affiliation, ownership of property, and region where one grew up. As compared to the regression model without the regional dummies, the R-square is only higher by about 0.5%. Table 4 ranks the 5 regions based on which area tends to have the highest support for social welfare. Seeing as Quebec was our reference category, the other 4 regions' effects on support for social welfare are assessed in relation to Quebec. Interestingly, the results differ from my original hypothesis of Ontario being the second most supportive of social welfare following Quebec, and the Prairies being the least supportive because they are the most conservative. Significantly, the beta values recorded in Table 4 show that a 1 standard deviation unit increase in the chance a respondent is from the East increases that respondent's support for social welfare by 0.04 standard deviations from the mean, whereas an increase in the chance a respondent is from BC decreases that respondent's support for social welfare the most, by 0.05 deviations from the mean. Now to summarize the findings. In both models, replication was observed for all variables, and party affiliation seemed to have the strongest influence on level of support for social welfare, followed by whether a respondent believes that the government should act to reduce income differences. Finally, coming from a certain region seemed to affect one's level of support for social welfare. The second model found that if you come from the East, you are more supportive of welfare, and if you come from BC, you tend to be the least supportive of welfare. These were both unexpected findings given my hypothesis. It was seen in both regression models that party affiliation is the strongest predictor for level of support for social welfare. Further research might want to look at if there's any relationship between the levels of public opinion on social welfare and how social welfare policies are actually executed, especially in certain regions.